Chapter 7. The Battle for Basra. I don't know if it was the lack of sleep, operational stress, the battlefield trauma, or witnessing the civilian casualties, or maybe a combination of all. But the days seemed to disappear until we arrived at Basra International Airport on the 23rd of March. Allied air power had once again flexed its superior muscles and had decimated most of the Iraqi forces. This was supported by the artillery and tanks from the 1 RRF battle group, which had resulted in the less-equipped Iraqi army being easily defeated. By the time we had dismounted to assault Basra International Airport, we were just clearing out any stragglers who were brave enough to remain and fight. It was our job to clear the terminal building, and we dismounted several hundred metres away to allow the tanks and warrior crews to provide adequate firepower. As we advanced, our first priority was to clear the runway of any Iraqi infantry. However, as we thoroughly cleared the Iraqi defensive position and vehicles, there was no resistance whatsoever. By now, the runways were a graveyard of charred Iraqi soldiers and dismembered body parts. Once you've been up close and smelt the burnt remains of what was once a person, the smell, the taste, stays with you for life. At the time, this didn't bother me, as we prodded these corpses with our bayonets for signs of life. This was our new normal. This was a necessary evil, as we had received intelligence that some soldiers were hiding amongst the enemy dead, attempting to ambush us. Until you've experienced warfare firsthand, it is impossible to contemplate the soldier's mindset. Your fear and anxiety are gradually taken over by a numbness as you emotionally shut down to an almost dormant state of mind. Your training kicks in, and all of the death, destruction, and the darker side of warfare become just a normal daily occurrence as you enter a zombie-like state. This process is inevitable and varies in the time it takes. But personally, and for the men of 23 Charlie, this had happened on the first day of the war. I would remain in the emotionless mindset for the many years that followed, as this prevented me from acknowledging my own battlefield trauma. Memories that I would suppress in a hopeless attempt to forget the collateral damage, the death of civilians, the darker side of warfare. I recall that we entered the terminal building at international arrivals, ironically, a week previously. This was my perfect summer holiday, and now it had turned into a summer hell. We swept through the airport, swiftly clearing room by room, corridors and lounges. My men were fluid and proficient, and moved as one. I was proud of their professionalism. We could hear firefights close by, and I was monitoring the battlefield radio for updates and new orders when I suddenly noticed a sign for the duty-free shop. I knew that several of my team were smokers and had run out of cigarettes. So, it was time to raise the morale of my men. Let's take a detour to the duty-free. I could still hear Iraqi resistance close by, and then some loud screams of "Room clear!" and "Corridor clear!" from other British soldiers. The race was now on for the spoils of war, for the duty-free. To my surprise, we were not the first soldiers to think about this, and a fellow section from the Irish Guards had beaten us there and were already stocking up on essential supplies. We grabbed a few packs of smokes for the lads, as they didn't deserve any additional stress, a few chocolate bars, and a bottle of Jack Daniels, then returned to mission. Looting is illegal, but the welfare of my men superseded this little misdemeanour. We'd all been exposed to the harsh reality of warfare and needed a pick-me-up. After all, one of the key principles of war is maintenance of morale. And my men needed this boost to their morale to sustain and prepare them for the battles to come. That night we slept in the airport, and a battery of AS-90 self-propelled guns moved in close by. The persistent loud firing throughout the night comforted me and helped me catch up on some much-needed sleep in the same way a lullaby is to a baby. The following days we were resupplied and rested, and the battle preparation and planning was now fully underway to assault the southern Iraqi city of Basra. I can only suspect that I was being punished for not following orders on the advance to contact, as my team were always tasked for rear protection and vehicle checkpoint duties during our stay at the airport. We were now all together as a company, and the other Irish Guardsmen would mock us for being put on these duties, as they were tasked with more offensive missions. However, they were unaware of what we'd been through, and none of us spoke of what we had witnessed. In fact, none of my men have ever spoken to me about their poor mental health, or the incident at the village, in the years that followed. This is the way things were back then, and of course, one must not forget that we were trained to ignore our emotions. We were all psychologically fragile, and, looking back, maybe we were given these boring duties, not as a punishment, but as a respite. For the next 10 days, we would siege the city of Basra in what, in military terms, is called an investment phase. British forces would strategically put a ring of armour around the southern section of the city and gradually creep forward until we were in the best tactical situation to assault the city, or break in. I cannot recall the exact date, but I do remember conducting a relief in place at night with some American forces, and it was something that you would expect straight out of a Hollywood movie. We had dismounted and were moving forward through the lines of US soldiers. I was at point and was asking the American soldiers for directions to their commander for orders. There was no stealth involved here, as a loud tank battle was ongoing around us and everything was quite chaotic and very loud. As I approached the front of the battle, I stopped and paused for a minute to take in the whole picture. American Abrams main battle tanks were hitting the inferior Iraqi tanks relentlessly. Some were in flames, but others just emitted white sparks as if they were hit by fireworks. My panoramic view was then lit up by illumination rounds from the artillery AS-90 battery stationed at the airport, and I saw the commander I was looking for. I approached the commander and explained that we were here to relieve him. This American cavalryman was well over 6 foot tall and was wearing a Stetson cowboy hat. He looked awesome. He excitedly began to break down the battle space and gave me a brief on the ongoing battle. I had chosen to forget the incident in the village that had happened less than a week ago and was in total awe of this Texan. He had explained that the Iraqis were sneaky and had attempted to outflank his forces, but he had cut them off and warned me about the threat to my armour due to the rocket-propelled grenade, RPG teams. I could have observed and listened to this Texan all night, but interrupted and asked where the pre-dug infantry positions were located. He condescendingly replied, "Are you a grunt?" before mockingly giving me the once-over. "The grunts are that way." He then pointed to his left, and we moved off to find our pre-dug positions. I never caught this Texan's name, but he was a charismatic and inspiring commander, even for a Yank. Eventually, we found some of the US infantry and conducted our relief in place, and can recall that I was shocked that the Americans were just lying in the open without any cover. I questioned them as to why they had not dug any trenches, to be told that the ground was too hard. I then called my section over and explained that we would be digging 3 trenches, and this would provide us cover and protection from RPGs, tanks and artillery, as well as from small arms fire. I added some extra incentive by explaining that the Americans didn't dig in, because the ground was too tough for them. It didn't take long for my lads to break the tough top surface of rocks with pickaxes, and our trenches were taking form, well before the American soldiers departed. In fact, as soon as they'd left, my lads' enthusiasm and work ethic suddenly dwindled. It's amazing how a little international rivalry can motivate soldiers. The following day, we came under intense artillery fire, and we were thankful that we had worked throughout the night to dig these trenches. Initially, the artillery fire was nowhere near us. It was a few hundred metres to our front, and we joked amongst ourselves at how incompetent the Iraqi soldiers were. Then, the next was 150 metres to our rear, then 100 metres to our front, and so on. This was no longer funny, as they were bracketing us, a technique used to find the correct range of your target, and it wouldn't be long until they were right on our position. My platoon commander then gave the order for all dismounts, us, to return to our vehicles for safety. This was by far the worst place we could be during an artillery bombardment. 10 soldiers crammed in a vehicle like sardines, surrounded by thousands of bullets, shells, anti-tank weapons, grenades and explosives. Furthermore, the top of these vehicles has some of the least amount of armour, and as such, this is their weakest area. All it would take was one bomb to land on or near our warrior vehicle, and all of us would have been killed. These vehicles were packed with explosives and, in this situation, a powder keg. This was the wrong call. I was unaware whether the rest of the platoon had dug trenches that night, but my section had worked tirelessly digging our own trenches. We had dug 3 trenches that were 5 feet deep and over 30 metres apart, and this was difficult to achieve, as we had to smash through the top layer of rock and had sacrificed our sleep to achieve this. Then, we had reinforced them with sandbags in anticipation of enemy action, especially artillery or mortar fire, and as a result of this, my men were going to stay in our trenches. The worst type of scenario you can find yourself in during combat is when you are under effective enemy artillery fire, as you have no idea where the enemy are firing at you from due to the ranges involved. Normally, with small arms fire, standard guns and rifles, it is relatively easy to identify the enemy's position. Through training and experience, this can be achieved. But from indirect fire from mortars and artillery, it is near impossible to identify due to the vast distance of these weapon systems. Therefore, all we could do was observe from the safety of our trenches until the shells were on top of us. At this point, no matter how brave we all pretended to be, you hug the person next to you and hope for the best. Pez chose to hug me, and as I didn't want to be considered rude, I hugged him right back. In this very open public letter, Ski describes this incident as the following. We got hit hard by enemy artillery, which was landing 10 to 15 metres away. It was the most awful sound, and it felt like the ground just opened up and tried to swallow us. I unreservedly agree with Ski, as the sound of the artillery bombs was deafening, and all we could do was hope that one of these Iraqi shells didn't hit us directly. Then, there was the added risk of being crushed to death if a shell landed close enough to compromise the integrity of our trenches. I recall this ordeal as being terrifying, as I was no longer in control. There is a warranted sense of helplessness when you are on the receiving end of artillery fire, and, for me, I no longer had any influence over the fate of my men. I was unable to return fire, unable to influence that battle, as Pez and I held tightly onto each other. Yet again it would be the American Super Cobra attack helicopters that would come to our aid, and moments after they flew over our position, the artillery barrage ceased. However, this time there were no high fives, no jubilation. We were all thankful that the artillery had stopped firing, but at what cost? The Cobra attack gunships had engaged the artillery within the city of Basra, a densely populated civilian area. For a brief moment, I wondered about any potential civilian casualties, before dismissing this as unwanted afterthought and going to check on my men. We were all shaken by the artillery barrage, but my men seemed okay on the outside. Or maybe, like myself, they had now become emotionally numb. From a commander's perspective, this significant attack had now emphasized that the Iraqi army were more competent than we had previously given them credit for. We were planning to cross the Basra Canal and advance on the city, and I was concerned about battlefield fatigue and the physical sustainability of my men. It had never even crossed my mind that this artillery attack may have been traumatic for them, as no training was ever provided to educate commanders to consider the mental well-being of their soldiers. Besides, I was suppressing my own emotions, as taught, and this was aiding me to manage my own battlefield trauma. After this artillery barrage, we were happy to be advancing forward, and we were all relieved. This was courtesy of the armoured element of the Royal Engineers. These brave soldiers had advanced forward to dig huge berms that would provide the infantry with cover and the armoured elements with protection for their hulls. These berms were at a suitable height that the tanks could still fire whilst offering some protection from small arms and RPG fire, and we mounted up and advanced a few hundred metres closer to the city. Then once we dismounted, we began to immediately dig in again. This time, though, trenches were not needed, but the shallower shell scrapes. We were now part of a combined defensive front on a baseline of 3 warrior crews. 2 tanks, 2 Milan units on their flanks, snipers, and an American forward air controller. One of our objectives was to prevent the destruction of a vital bridge on the 31 highway. There were 2 other such bridges to the south, and all 3 were critical to the battle plan. These bridges covered the large man-made Basra Canal and were critical to our operational planning. So as such, lethal force was authorized to ensure the survival of these structures. Leaflets were dropped daily over Basra to warn the civilian population not to attempt to cross these bridges. There were even giant speakers set up, blasting this message across. Surely the civilian population had received the message. Unfortunately, this was not the case, and I can recall several vehicles being destroyed by British Challenger 2 main battle tanks that approached the bridge. I do not know if these were genuine civilians, but the tanks engaged all vehicles that attempted to cross these bridges. Our tank crews had some difficult decisions to make, as we had previously received an intelligence report that the Fedayeen were planning to send civilian vehicles laden with explosives towards these bridges in an attempt to collapse them and stall our impending advance. The repercussions of this would be inevitable coalition casualties, and this was a heartless tactical decision that a senior commander had made. It is easy to give such an order, but is immensely difficult for the men of those tank crews, who had to fire on potential civilian vehicles to carry out. This is just another example of the darker side of war. The acceptable collateral damage and calculated loss of human life. Civilians. We'd not been under artillery fire since the Cobras had neutralised the Iraqi battery in the days prior, but the RPGs were coming in thick and fast. I recall one such day when Ricky was on stag, guard duty, on top of the berm, when an RPG whizzed close by. The majority of the rest of the section, including myself, was in our shell scrape to the rear, playing cards, when Ricky yelled, "They're firing RPGs at me!" We all broke into frantic laughter from the safety of our shell scrape, and of course the berm. From the tone of Ricky's voice, it sounded as if the Iraqis had specifically and exclusively only targeted him. Pez began to heckle Ricky as the Jimpy let out a thunderous burst. The snipers also engaged as more RPGs fizzed over us. Pez was our own personal jester, and as always lightened the mood. But he soon became very serious when I informed him that it was now his turn for stag, and he had to replace Ricky on the top of the berm. Then naturally, our soldiers' dark humour kicked in, and we all, including Ricky, began to heckle Pez. What goes around comes around, and the following day it would be my turn to be ridiculed. I remember that we had identified a building on the outskirts of the city that the Fedayeen were operating out of. Additionally, we'd also observed that the RPG teams had been mounting attacks from this building, and my warrior crew were trying to engage them. But their sight system was limited in range, and this had prevented them from effectively doing so. I had suggested that I acted as a spotter and could guide them into the target area. I borrowed one of the snipers' Sophie sights and began to guide my warrior gunner and his 30mm cannon into the Fedayeen's compound post. After about 10 attempts, we were finally on target in what can only be described as a spectacular lobbed shot. A Fedayeen fighter came to the window to jeer us, when boom, a 30mm high-explosive round landed in his very window, killing him. Unbeknownst to me, as they were on a different radio frequency, the tanks also wanted to play this game, as they had significantly more superior range than our warriors. It was obvious to the tank that had rolled up behind me, as I was committed to guiding my warrior crew onto our target. By now, the tank had put its barrel over me to acquire the direction of the target building. Boom! The tank fired a 120mm high-explosive round right above me, collapsing the Fedayeen headquarters. The vacuum of the shot instantly lifted me up off the floor, then promptly slammed me back down with thundering force. I was winded and temporarily deaf as I jumped into the shell scrape yelling, "Incoming!" I was disorientated and confused, to say the least, as my men laughed their socks off. When my ears finally stopped ringing, Pez informed me that it was just the tank firing. From that day forth, whenever a tank fired close by, my men would reassure me that there was no need to panic, and that it was just a friendly tank, and not incoming artillery fire. In the build-up to the all-out assault on Basra, the infantry attacks from Iraqi forces intensified. Yet again, from Ski's very open, honest letter, he states, "Once we got to the outskirts of Basra, we went firm and put a ring of steel around it. No one could come out. It was like the Wild West. The enemy were constantly trying to have a pop, but they never had a chance. I was watching them get cut down by our tank shells, cut in half by our machine guns. I was next to my best mate, Mac, who was on the machine gun when he shot an Iraqi in half." Chris is now being treated for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well. I do recall Mac repelling a heavy enemy assault with the Jimpy, and he was an exceptional shot with this machine gun, as he was engaging targets up to 800 metres away. This was generally followed with the usual bravado, and we gave no thought to the fact that these were fathers, brothers, husbands and sons. These were brave men. They were outgunned, and they still advanced towards us, knowing that they possessed inferior weapons that had less range and accuracy. At the time, I didn't care who they were. But after the war, it dawned on me how courageous these Iraqi soldiers actually were. I now have the utmost respect for all of the Iraqi army, even those who bombarded me with artillery fire. The battlefield trauma from this early period in the war would further exacerbate Ski's deteriorating mental health. I often think about these incidents, and, although I respected the Iraqi forces, I've never felt any guilt or remorse towards those that were killed. The civilians, however, that's where my own trauma lies. And I can only suspect that this was the same for the rest of my men. Ski continues. I look back on these incidents a lot. Some of them haunt me and have ruined my life. I get bad flashbacks and nightmares. It makes everyday life very difficult for me. Ski would later be told that he did not, in fact, have PTSD. But instead, he was diagnosed with a personality disorder. This was 2005. And if the British Army admitted that Ski had PTSD from his battlefield exploits and experiences, then the Ministry of Defence would be accountable for his poor mental health and criminal actions. Yet, due to the negative national media coverage that surrounded his court case, it was easier for the top brass to separate and isolate Ski to avoid any further bad press. This raises many questions, especially as I shared all of the same symptoms as Ski. Yet why was I not diagnosed with the same personality disorder? Fundamentally, the Ministry of Defence would abandon and distance themselves as far as possible from Ski when it was obvious that he needed help and was in pain. His poor mental health would evolve into an irrational thought process that would convince Ski that he needed an assault rifle for the protection of his family. So, as a result, he stole one from Wellington Barracks. Subsequently, he was arrested and jailed for 7 years and was disregarded by the very institution that had trained him, reprogrammed his psyche, and ultimately sent him to war. Ski would not be the only soldier to be diagnosed with a personality disorder in this period, and I genuinely believe that this was a result of all the bad press that was targeted towards the British Army. Let us not forget that the Blair government blamed the illegal war in Iraq on the British armed forces in what can only be classed as a political masterstroke. By no means am I vindicating Ski's actions, but it was blatantly clear that he was suffering from PTSD, a direct consequence of his battlefield trauma. The day would finally come for our assault on Basra to take place. We'd been gradually wearing down the Iraqi forces over the past week, and now it was time to conduct the break-in. We were all solely focused on the mission, and none of my men showed any signs of their deteriorating mental health. Or maybe they did, but I was oblivious to it. On the morning of the 6th of April, we stormed the city after a series of airstrikes. I remember listening to the thunderous roar from the explosions taking place from the seclusion of the cave in the back of the armoured fighting vehicle as we approached the outskirts of the city. I recall that I was eagerly listening to the battlefield reports coming through on the radio and was trying to pass on the information to my men, as we were literally kept in the dark as we approached. My first mission was to clear an Iraqi RPG training barracks a few blocks into the city. Dickie, the warrior vehicle commander, began the countdown, and we exited, spread out, and got into all-round defence. I reminded my men to watch the rooftops and the windows for snipers and RPGs, as this was now a three-dimensional environment. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I then requested that the warrior blew the wooden gates off the barracks to our front, and to my disappointment, the 30mm high-explosive rounds didn't explode, but went straight through. I guess the gates would have to be opened the old-fashioned way. Our warrior revved its engine and easily smashed through the gates, and our infantry assault could now commence. I can recollect that the barracks consisted of a two-tier structure, set out in a rectangular courtyard with a veranda and pillars on the right-hand side. As we approached, I ordered my men to immediately clear the ground floor, as we could utilize the cover of this veranda and pillars to our advantage. As we moved forward, for some bizarre reason, I was treating this like a training exercise and was providing instructions to my men. I remember walking past my men whilst critiquing them. "Mac, cover the window. Pez, watch the second tier. Dave, use that pillar as a better firing position." Then an RPG whizzed by and exploded to our rear. This was followed by a burst of small arms fire that was close enough to feel, and I was fortunate to avoid. My training instantly kicked in, and I dropped to my knee and took some cover next to Dave. The penny had finally dropped, that I was in an urban firefight, and I could feel my adrenaline take effect. My right elbow was stiff, and I could feel a warm, damp feeling running down my right leg. Had I been shot? Regardless, this would have to wait, as we had a job to do. We methodically and mechanically then cleared the barracks in a fluid-like motion. I remember hearing shouts of, "Room clear! Floor clear!" And it wasn't long before the barracks were cleared and deemed safe. The Iraqi soldiers had evacuated and had put up little resistance as we were entering. The job was complete. It was time to check my injuries. I was nervous to put my hand on the back of my thigh and felt a warm wetness. But oddly, when I looked at it, there was no blood and it was clear. My initial thoughts were, have I pissed myself? I checked again and smelt my hand, and it wasn't piss. This was water. The burst of rounds that had narrowly missed me on our entry had ricocheted off the nearby wall and smashed my water bottle, as well as hitting my elbow. I was fine, but realised how lucky I had been. There would be no more live instructional lessons in combat from now on. I'd learned my lesson the hard way. I never mentioned this to any of my team, as I am certain that they would have mocked me for it, especially Pez. My elbow still aggravates me from time to time, but this was a welcome reminder of how fortunate I had been. When we returned to our vehicle, a mob was gathering. I'd been in civilian-led riots in Kosovo and was aware of how quickly they could escalate. These non-combatants appeared agitated, yet their anger wasn't directed at us. The mob was centred around a young woman who was waving her bloodied hijab in the air. The mob started to chant, "Saddam Jundi! Saddam Jundi!" We had learned basic Arabic and knew that they were trying to tell us about Iraqi soldiers, but we had to regroup with our platoon for new orders. The distressed woman then raised her arm in a chopping motion to her own arm and yelled, "Baby!" The mob had just informed us that the Iraqi soldiers had chopped her baby's arm off to keep them quiet. I had just received my new orders, and it was to kill these bastards that had mutilated this baby. I immediately commanded my men to close in and issued some quick battle orders. I was aware that this could be a trap, but that was doubtful, as the civilian population of Basra hated Saddam Hussein. Regardless, we had to be careful and expect an ambush. My mind, yet again, raced back to Kosovo, the morgue, and all those dead civilians. I had just been gifted an opportunity to do some good, and to prevent any more harm to future non-combatants at the hands of these cruel soldiers. I thought about the infamous phrase, "Evil triumphs when good men do nothing." I desperately wanted to repent and be a good man, and this was my opportunity. As you can imagine, my vehicle crew were not too pleased, as this action would leave them vulnerable, and this was not part of our mission. Plans often changed in combat, and my mind was set. It was time to move out, but quietly, in stealth, without the support of my armoured fighting vehicle. The mob had pointed us in the direction of the compound of a large upper-class building, and we halted the crowd as we began our stealthy assault. We didn't know what we were up against, and had to carry out some reconnaissance before we could strike. Stevie took my Delta fire team around the back of the structure as an initial cut-off, and my fire team observed from the front. I identified 2 sets of military-grade boots at the front door and gave the commands to conduct a simultaneous breach. I ordered my men to use lethal force if necessary, but, if possible, they should be taken alive. I began a 5-second countdown on the radio, and my heart began to race. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go, go, go! We breached both the front and back simultaneously. I booted the front door off its hinges and led my team in. I was in an open area, and we swept immediately to the left to a kitchen where an Iraqi Jundi was washing the blood off his arms and clothes. There was a large bloodied machete next to him, but before he could reach for it, I headbutted him, and he fell to the floor. Concurrently, my Delta fire team had also breached, also sweeping to their left, and had captured another Iraqi Jundi. Both these Iraqi soldiers resisted capture, and lethal force could have been used, but I wanted them to pay for their crimes. I wanted them alive. We restrained our prisoners, and I told the lads to search the building for evidence. This place was a gold mine, and we bagged their uniforms, weapons, papers, and a computer. These were 2 high-ranking Iraqi officers, and we found vast amounts of intelligence and treasures, including captured loot from the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. This intelligence coup would prove vital in the coming weeks, and these Jundi would be later interrogated by special forces, which we had the opportunity to observe. Returning to our vehicle was a difficult task, as the crowd demanded mob justice. The woman with the bloodied hijab was now parading her limbless baby, who was actually about 7 or 8 years old. This kid was screaming and was inciting the mob even further. It would have been an easy decision to leave these 2 scumbags to the mercy of the mob, and I did consider it, as the mob was now becoming hostile towards us. However, I was aware of the bigger picture and what intelligence could be extracted out of these 2 high-ranking officers. We fought our way through the mob, as the captured Jundi were relentlessly beaten and managed to link up with our vehicle and then eventually the rest of the platoon. Then, we somehow managed to cram these 2 into our warrior, despite them fighting us at every opportunity. I can only imagine what the shock of capture actually feels like, and they may have believed that we were going to execute them. This was no different from what I had taught my men. Always fight, never give up, and escape and evade where possible. And I could respect their guile. When we arrived at our platoon's location and the warriors' back door opened, we all spilt out onto the floor, and a scuffle broke out. One of the Iraqi officers was reaching for a weapon, and yet again lethal force could have been used, but instead Dave used his less lethal right fist. We then handed these prisoners over to our platoon sergeant, and that was the last we saw of them, until their interrogation. This was conducted in a warehouse at night, with the sole light above the Jundi, as they were asked questions, reminiscent of a Hollywood movie. The intelligence that was gained from these two Iraqi officers would later be used to conduct a citywide manhunt for the Iraqi general and war criminal Ali Hassan Abd al-Majid, also known as Chemical Ali. Blair was desperate to find evidence of WMDs, and this had become our main efforts once the city of Basra was captured. Chemical Ali had been rumoured to be hiding out in the area of Basra to the north, by the port, but he was able to evade us. He would be captured later that year and sentenced to death for war crimes, including genocide. As the war progressed, more emphasis was put on us to find evidence of WMDs. From a discussion with President Bush on the 24th of March, Mr. Blair underlined the importance of coalition forces finding Saddam's WMDs. It is evident that Blair was already aware of the growing anti-war movement back home and the prospect of answering to the people for the invasion and his illegal war. It was around this time that Fusilier Turrington was killed. My memory is very vague about this incident, but what I do remember is how badly this affected his section commander and his friends, and how hard they fought to save his life. Ski wrote, "About 2 weeks into the battle, Fusilier Keelan Turrington was shot in the neck by a sniper and died there and then on the spot. He was just lying there because no one would go near him because of sniper fire. It seemed like he was there for hours. It was like time stopped. Not nice at all." Tommy recalls our platoon commander crying uncontrollably shortly after this incident and having to tell him to get his shit together. Our platoon commander was young and inexperienced, and this death had occurred on his watch. But Tommy was right. His job was to lead, and the mourning of Turrington would have to wait. Tommy went on to explain how badly this had shaken all of the commanders, apart from himself, and that he felt nothing on an emotional level. All that concerned him was the death and destruction of the enemy, and that he hoped to go out in a blaze of glory. Tommy had yearned to become a regimental history question throughout his battlefield exploits, which implied a brave and honourable death, with medals, of course. He also remembers my section casualty evacuating a young girl who had been shot, and yet this didn't alarm him in any way. Tommy is by no means a sociopath, but this is the mindset that some soldiers revert to in combat. Emotionless, pragmatic, killing machines. We suppress our feelings and emotions, and this allows us to function, to do our jobs, and to stay alive. Fortunately for Tommy, his military mindset would revert back to a more socially acceptable one once he had settled down and started a family. Following the tragic death of Turrington, I volunteered my men to double up on patrols to give the other section time to grieve and process his death. I didn't know Turrington, and his death didn't affect me as much as maybe it should have. However, the reaction of watching what his death did to his section, especially his commander, had a significant impact on me. We would later be informed that 2 of our own Irish Guardsmen, Lance Corporal Ian Molly Malone and Piper Christopher Musveru, were killed on the same day in a different part of the city. I didn't know Musveru, but I'd been out drinking with Molly before the war. I didn't know Molly that well, just enough to have a few beers and a chat with at our local watering hole in Munster. Yet, I felt nothing. I was emotionless. That night we were tasked with clearing a main supply route in the north of the city, and the patrol consisted of 2 warriors and 2 sections of infantry. I had volunteered to satellite around the vehicle in the side streets on foot, whilst the other Fusilier section patrolled, side by side, the accompanying armour. There was no power and limited sanitation, and wild dogs roamed the alleyways. These side streets were the perfect place for an ambush, and the whole patrol had an eerie feel about it. I had the feeling that something bad was about to happen. Then, I heard a fierce growing mumble that quickly grew into a growl. The largest wild dog that I've ever seen was blocking our path. I contemplated shouting for the Gympie, but opted to backtrack and return to our vehicles, when the city lit up. The vehicles had driven into an ambush, and they were taking incoming fire. I could hear my radio buzzing the words, "Contact! Wait out!" We tactically but rapidly returned to the main road, only to find that our 2-vehicle convoy had departed. We'd been abandoned, forsaken on the streets of Basra, and had just patrolled into an ambush. I yelled at my men to keep to the shadows and to observe the rooftops, as this was not the remnants of the Iraqi army, but the Fedayeen, a fanatical militia. The British Army was currently using an outdated and unreliable Klansman radio series, and I was carrying the inconsistent Model 349 at the time. The only reliable feature on the 349 was that it was unreliable when you needed it most, and I was now left with no communications. I didn't have a map. Didn't even know exactly where we were. My men looked at me for direction, and I had to do something, as we were under effective enemy fire. I informed my men that we would conduct a hard extraction under fire, but not in the conventional sense, where we would peel in past each other. This was far too slow. We needed to extract as quickly as possible if we were to make it out of this ambush alive. I quickly briefed my men that Stevie would lead and head in the direction of the vehicles, and that myself and Ski would cover their extraction from the rear. This is where I made a hard tactical decision. I didn't tell my men, but this extraction would not stop, even if we had a casualty. I had 7 guns, and it would take 2 more guns to carry that casualty, reducing my firepower to 4 and slowing our extraction, which would ultimately lead to more casualties. This decision still troubles me, and I do not know if I would have been able to see it through. Thankfully, though, we successfully extracted. I vividly recall that as the rest of the section extracted, Ski and I struggled to keep up. We were both very fit, but covering the team under effective enemy fire whilst manoeuvring ourselves was mentally and physically exhausting. I was yelling, "Prepare to move! Move!" Ski would scream his reply, "Moving!" The green tracer rounds were lighting up our rear, and Ski was performing admirably. Then my radio began to get a signal. I angrily shouted, 23! This is 23 Charlie! Stop your extraction! You've left us behind, and we are in contact!" The armoured vehicles finally stopped and began to reverse towards us, and we eventually caught up, after what felt like an eternity. And when we opened the back door of our Warrior, we were met with a surprise. When the vehicles had initially come under heavy fire, half of the section patrolling next to them had climbed into my vehicle and had shut the door for protection. Once the door was shut, the crew had anticipated that we were all in safely and shot off out of the ambush, breaking contact. There was no time for explanations, and we were still in contact, and we couldn't all fit in one vehicle. I furiously yelled, "Delta Fire Team, you get in your vehicle. My fire team will get in the other vehicle." I was beyond angry at the Warrior crew and the Fusiliers that had hijacked my vehicle, but more so with myself. I had never thought that I would ever be in a position where I would essentially condemn one of my men and, despite the fact that this was a conscious decision that was never acted on, it still plays on my mind to this day. During the next few days, our mission was to secure all of the key objectives in Basra, such as power plants, hospitals, sewage works and the docks. Mass looting by the local population was well underway, and we seemed to secure facility after facility before being moved on. Eventually, we would find a short-lived home in a scrapyard, and this would provide us with some stability and routine. We would rotate through a cycle of patrols to guard duty, then rest/quick reaction force, similar to what I had experienced in Kosovo. I recall that on one such patrol cycle, we did a snap visit to an ice cream parlour, and I treated my lads to some special Basra ice creams. The Iraqi army had been defeated, but the Fedayeen-inspired militia was still at large. By now, we had our own area of the city, and we were familiar with our northern area of responsibility when it came under contact from small arms fire. Pez screamed out in pain, and I seriously thought he'd been shot. He yelled, "I need a shit!" But it was too late. The special Basra ice cream had given us all a serious case of deli belly, and Pez was its first victim. We were all in cover, on either side of the road as small arms fire passed between us, when I saw Pez shuffle towards me with his combat trousers dropped down by his ankles, dripping with diarrhea. For the second time in as many months, he was yelling, "Somebody please shoot me!" It's a miracle that the insurgents never did. And it wasn't through a lack of trying. Pez continued to shout and moan as he made his way to some bushes to empty what was left of his bowels. The insurgents eventually withdrew once we returned effective fire, and the men of 23 Charlie awkwardly made our way back to our patrol base, with our butt cheeks tightly clenched. We eventually de-escalated our aggressive patrol patterns, removed our camouflage cream, and swapped our helmets for berets, and became more of a peacekeeping force rather than a fighting one. The majority of the population were happy to have been liberated from the iron fist of Saddam Hussein, and initially we were greeted like heroes. There was secular religious division between the Sunni and Shia Muslims in Iraq, and the population of Basra was mostly Shia. The former ruling Ba'ath Party had favoured the Sunni population, and this led to the Basra uprising in the aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War. The following is an extract from a BBC News article that highlights how Saddam Hussein, a Sunni Muslim, dealt with the Shia uprising and highlights the depth of the religious divide. Some were shot in their homes and houses. Others, young men especially, were rounded up from the streets and later executed en masse. Others still were gunned down by helicopter gunships, piloted by Saddam Hussein's Republican Guards as they tried to flee. Women and children were among the targets of the violent crackdown. Saddam Hussein would also order the bombing of Shia religious sites and temples in Basra and the surrounding area as further punishment. Basra had been governed through fear and violence, and now there was a power vacuum. Along with the Fedayeen and the Ba'ath Party, other militias were beginning to form and stake a claim to the city. We were now acting as peacekeepers and had reverted to a humanitarian role, and this would involve water, food and medical distribution, as well as maintaining law and order. Early one morning, when returning from a night patrol, we received orders that the central bank was being robbed. We were aware that Saddam had kept cash and gold reserves there, and if acquired by any of these militias, they would be able to fund a devastating counter-insurgency campaign against us. We were on foot, but that didn't matter, as my section of men were exceptionally fit and robust, and we ran to the bank and breached without even pausing to take a breath. To our amazement, the vault was open, but there was nobody else around. Once we had secured the building, we entered the vault, and my eyes lit up. There were several pallets of US $100 bills, stacked up to at least 5 feet high, wrapped in cellophane. There were millions of dollars right in front of us, and suddenly I felt like Scrooge McDuck. The conversation immediately began about whether or not we should help ourselves to the spoils of war. One must not be too quick to judge, as we were all from lower working-class families. Well, let's be honest. We were poor. I've never been motivated by money, but this opportunity was too good to overlook. Then I thought about the airstrike and the persecution of the people of Basra at the hands of the malicious Saddam Hussein. This was blood money, and stunk of death. I told my men that this money belongs to the people of Basra, that it was dirty and contaminated, and had an immeasurable amount of unjust deaths associated with it. Therefore, as a result of this, I would categorically not be taking any of the nicely stacked wedges of $100 bills home with me. However, if they chose to, I would turn a blind eye. Despite everything that I had put them through, they still continued to make me proud, as they all chose to leave Saddam's blood money in that vault. In hindsight, now that I have a mortgage and a family, I look back at this decision and often wonder if we all made the correct choices, as I could now have been mortgage-free. My section had been given the nickname of the Suicide Seven due to the simple fact that I would volunteer us for every dangerous mission. Our young platoon commander was at times indecisive and would rarely delegate. Then again, I don't think any of the other section commanders, including myself, made his job any easier. Besides, there was an unspoken inter-regiment rivalry between the 1 RRF and the Irish Guards to bear in mind as well. I remember our platoon commander briefing us on some recent intelligence that a newly established Royal Military Police station was going to be targeted by insurgents that very evening. He was fishing for volunteers and, like clockwork, and to the dismay of my men, 23 Charlie would yet again offer our services. This was the beginning of May. The war had officially ended, and some of us just wanted to return home safely. Personally, I don't think that I ever wanted to return home. I wanted to remain numb, and to forget the darker side of warfare that I had witnessed, and, more pertinently, been part of. That same afternoon we arrived at a medium-sized 2-tier building set on a cross-junction with a canal to its rear. I approached these 4 Royal Military Police, our MPs, stationed there, and asked who was in command. A sergeant informed me that he was, and despite still only being a lance corporal at this point, and 2 ranks his junior, I cockily replied, "Not any more." The RMP sergeant didn't take this very well, and in hindsight maybe I could have explained the situation better. This wasn't about rank, but about protecting my fellow British soldiers. So I promptly reminded him why we were there. I bluntly informed him that we were here to fend off an attack directed at his 4-man team by between 10 and 20 insurgents that evening. These police officers were poorly equipped with low levels of ammunition. They did have a medium machine gun, but with only 100 rounds of ammunition. Once our battle of egos had finished, I instructed my men to deploy claymores and trip flares to the rear and the flanks for protection. We even managed to hide our warrior in the garage of the building. My plan was to defend this building from the roof, as this gave us an excellent line of sight for our weapons, with its clear fields of view and good all-round defence. We then smashed a hole in the roof and opened the mortar hatches on top of the back of the warrior, so that we could jump into it from our defensive position on the roof if needed. This would enable us to quickly extract if we were overrun, or alternatively, to conduct an offensive manoeuvre. Once on the roof, I observed that the RMPs were in poor defensive positions. It was not their primary role to fight. After all, they were policemen, with limited combat training and experience. However, they even had their main weapon, the jimpy, facing the canal. This canal was over 5 metres wide and was not crossable, and the jimpy was poorly positioned there. I was more than happy with the trip flare that I had positioned there, as it was very unlikely that the attack would come from the rear due to this water obstacle. I repositioned them all, and doubled them up with my men, and, to their surprise, once in position, some of my lads got their sleeping bags out and attempted to get some rest. None of the RMPs rested that evening, whereas my men rotated their sleep and would be fresh for the impending attack. I was woken by the familiar sound of the jimpy singing. Dave was covering the road junction and was already engaging a large crowd. I had doubled him up with 2 GPMGs, so that he could switch guns quickly to prevent them from overheating. I approached his position to get eyes on the advancing militia in order to formulate a defensive plan. Concurrently, Mac jumped onto the 51mm light mortar and fired an illumination bomb that provided us with some much-needed visibility. I remember being slightly confused as the malicious assault had stopped and they were being engaged by another mob. Instinctively, I checked my battlefield radio just to make sure there weren't any friendly units in the area, and once this was confirmed, my quick battle orders would entail a full frontal assault. I signalled for Pez and Ricky to follow me into the warrior, and informed them that we would assault the militia. Stevie was to coordinate and provide covering fire from the rooftop with Ski and Dave. Mac would continue to use the 51mm mortar to illuminate the enemy, and that the RMPs should cover our rear flanks. Do nothing. No sooner had we jumped in through the roof of the warrior and fired up the engine than it burst through the garage doors, collapsing the front of the structure's wall. As the warrior advanced towards this chaos, the 3 of us deployed out of the back to get a better view from the ground. It soon became evident that there were 2 different militias fighting each other, and I didn't want to get involved in a Mexican standoff. I decided to withdraw my men to the RMP station and let these 2 warring factions shoot it out. For the remainder of the night, we observed just that, and the following morning, we were relieved of our RMP protection duties. This would be our last engagement as a section. The insurgents that were approaching our location on the previous night had been engaged by an Iraqi security team assigned to protect a former local politician. They believed that the insurgents had come for them and had initiated the firefight. and, in doing so, repelled the attack that was meant for us. Regardless, our deployment orders had come in, and we would be returning home. As heroes? Our time in Iraq, and our war, was over. But for some of the men of 23 Charlie, a hidden war, the war from within, had just begun.